This video ended up being wildly different from what I originally planned. I wanted to fanboy about HP releasing the first 3.5-inch floppy drive in the US, but had that assumption turned upside down when I started digging into it more. There was also a ton of drama around deciding what would even be the microfloppy standard format. I ended up spending about a month on this video and have done more research for it than any other before. There've been a lot of interesting things to look into, like did you know that this was originally called a cassette? So today, we're going to go over the origins of the 3.5-inch floppy, the ubiquitous disk that should have taken over the world a lot sooner, and I'm going to dispute some accepted history about it. After the 8-inch and 5.25-inch discs, it was considered inevitable that there would be another format that would shrink it down one more time. Informally, this concept was considered the shirt pocket disc, an idea so ingrained at one point, a writer of Byte joked it might be easier just to make shirt pockets bigger than to settle the later competing disc standards. The standard 8-inch disc was created by IBM in 1973 for the 3740 drive. Compatibility with that drive and disk formats spread throughout the industry and made distributing data much easier than other options like printed text or paper tape. 8-inch discs are massive though, and Shugart managed to shrink the concept down to 5.25-inch in 1976 with the SA400. This drive found its way into some of the biggest computers of 1977, making it another standard. But everyone knew this disk wasn't going to be the final solution. It was still inconveniently large as well as fragile with its susceptibility to bending and easily damaged media. The 3.5-inch disc that became so popular though wouldn't really establish its dominance until 1984, when Apple released the all-new Macintosh platform. Before that, though, was a battle between manufacturers to claim the crown of microfloppy. But what everyone didn't know was that this battle was over before it even started. The 3.5-inch, or perhaps more correctly, 90-centimeter floppy disk was developed by Sony. They actually have a company history page talking about this development process that I would say, while not perfect, is fairly accurate, as almost everything I could externally verify that they talk about matches up with other sources. In 1979, Sony was trying to break into the more technical focused portion of the US market and aimed to make a word processor. For reasons I still don't fully understand and they don't elaborate on, they decided to eschew standard components like the 5.25-inch disc and opted to make their own. It made some sense because Sony would be able to produce every part of the machine themselves then. And Sony didn't mess around with this either. They made an all-new drive and disk format that was smaller but held the same amount of data on one side as a double-sided 5.25-inch drive did at the time. The word processor they made would be known as the Series 35. It used a portrait orientation CRT that Sony was able to make themselves, with everything else integrated into a single keyboard case. This machine was introduced in late 1980 to early 1981 at the eye-watering cost of $9,000. So it didn't exactly take the world by storm. But those floppy drives would vastly outlive it. They were the OAD30V microfloppy drive, also known as an MFD. But these drives were not only new, they are the 3.5-inch floppy drives that would later become so common. Now, Sony wasn't just interested in being a full product company though. They wanted to work with other manufacturers to integrate these new floppy drives into their products. Sony was advertising this at least as early as April 1981, as can be seen here in Byte. They just had to put up a fight to get there. Alright, let's take a small break with an interesting anecdote about the size of these drives. They're twice as tall as the later 3.5-inch drives are, but they aren't full height officially, as that is the same as a half height 5.25-inch drive like a CD drive, which this is taller than. I would say it might be more accurate to call them double height drives. And I have no idea why Sony made them this size. Nothing else like early tape drives or hard drives I have matched them. They're just unique. Now, back to the history. Sony didn't get any takers for the drive in 1981. And before we go on, I just want to let that sink in. In late 1981, IBM released the first PC. After the 3.5-inch drive was available. There probably wasn't time for IBM to get it integrated, but I find it very amusing that the first PC was released with an audio cassette port after the 3.5-inch disc was available. But hindsight is 2020, and with how obvious it was that a new smaller disc format would be made, there was a trepidation to align with one format too early. And there were a handful of competitors that started showing up in 1982, but the most prominent one was announced by Matsushita and Hitachi. This was the CFD, Compact Floppy Disk, a 3-inch media format. And within a few months, there were commercially available drives being sold by companies like Amdek. The CFD was being taken to trade shows and shown to attract more support for it. Now, companies were taking sides on this to submit a joint standards proposal to ANSI, the American National Standards Institute. Oddly, these were all Japanese companies submitting these proposals. The American companies that had created the initial floppy disk standards weren't having an easy time making their own smaller drives. Now, there were notable technical differences between the CFD and Sony's MFD beyond the size of the drives. The CFD was a 300 RPM 40-track drive, which was essentially a scaled-down 5.25-inch drive. The Sony was 70 tracks initially and 600 RPM. More importantly, though, the Sony drive had a different interface from the Shugart standard that previous floppy drives used. This was one of a number of issues that companies raised with the Sony drive. For example, Sony discs used a shutter over the media to protect it, which was great, but the shutter had to be manually moved and could unintentionally expose the media to damage. The manual shutter is actually something I've been trying to find more information about. While the earliest discs I have do latch open, earlier ones wouldn't have closed with a spring. I also haven't been able to find a drive that needs it. I suspect they may have been a very short batch of them like that before they changed them to auto shutter discs. Now, the CFD was generally not as capable as the Sony drive, being both slower and lower capacity. But both formats had their supporters pushing to make their format the new standard. Eventually, ANSI just gave up and said they would let the companies duke it out in the market to decide. Now, there was an ANSI subcommittee known as the MIC, Microfloppy Industry Committee, made of many more companies that did like the Sony disk concept, but wanted some of the issues addressed. Sony was open to this, and the drives I've been showing here are the later revised OAD31V from 1983. Changes include the new spring arm to open and close the new purely auto shutter discs, along with some other minor improvements. Sony would also release the OAD32V and D32W that bumped up the tracks to 80 per side and made it double-sided. These revised models started to get more support, but even before this, the Sony drive had been making some significant headway in the market. Let's jump back to 1982. The CFD was being released as a standalone drive. Great for getting it into consumers' hands quickly, but it wasn't getting upstream support from OEMs and software vendors. This is where Sony was taking a different approach. Sony wanted to do two things with this drive: get it into other companies' devices, and release their own computer with it. A computer from Sony had been speculated since the previous year, but Sony was really dragging their feet on releasing it. In May of 1982, Sony finally put out a press release that revealed it, the Z80-based SMC70, but said that it wouldn't ship until September of that year. They were working with software companies to get products ready for it, and still working on a distribution network for final point of sale. While this was going on, Sony was also working on a deal with another company to provide them with 3.5-inch drives. There had been some rumors that HP was going to use Sony's new drives that were confirmed in May as well, actually, with the announcement of a $30 million contract between Sony and HP to supply the drives. These are the drives that would eventually be put into the 9121 unit I have that started all of this research. HP was a massive partner for Sony to get and brought a lot of credibility to the 3.5-inch format. This partnership lasted for some time as well, as HP continued using them all the way up until the 9122C drive with high-density disk support. Even non-computer devices like the 16500 series logic analyzer I have used Sony drives. HP was able to fully embrace the, at the time, uncommon drive thanks to their custom LIF file system and Amigo and CS80 interface protocols. But still, it showed success with the drives, and this partnership can likely be directly attributed to what I consider the nail in the coffin of the format wars, when Apple announced the Macintosh in 1984, also using Sony 3.5-inch drives. This brought the format mainstream, and though the CFD was still trying to cling to life in 1984, by 85, even companies that had supported it started making Sony-compatible products. In 1986, IBM would also finally adopt the 3.5-inch floppy disk with the PC convertible, confirming its position as the next major floppy standard. At this point in my research, I was pretty happy overall with the information I'd been able to put in place here, but there was still one thing bugging me. Was it Sony or HP that got the first computer out with a 3.5-inch floppy drive in it. In this era, you didn't really get official release dates for things because products were distributed through other companies to be sold at retail. The conventional wisdom has been that Sony was first, but everything I kept reading said it will release in September. Not so much that it did, other than Sony's own site. The HP was a lot more nebulous. The manual for the 9121 is vaguely dated 1982. So I decided to do some more digging. In June of 1982, Sony was showing a very complete-looking SMC-70 while mentioning they were still working out how to sell it. As an aside, let's revel in Bill Gates, for some reason, absolutely blasting it and saying no one will buy one, which he wasn't really wrong about because it was a CP/M system that was about to get decimated by the PC and MS-DOS duo. Now, in the same June issue of InfoWorld, there is also an announcement about the HP partnership, but we know that is old news based on an official press release in May. Delays between article publication and events and announcements started becoming much more apparent to me during this research process, and I started having to figure out where and when information originally came from. Two more better sources, though, were a later Interface Age issue that confirmed distribution beginning in September, and an Australian business computer that knew it was announced in May and claimed to be sold in October. So I would say September-October sounds pretty accurate based on the evidence. Meanwhile, the first announcement from HP I could find was in November of 1982, where they showed the drive and also talked about it being used with a new HP 120 computer. And the manual for that gives a first edition date of November 1982 as well. So it seems pretty clear that the SMC-70 did in fact release before the 9121 drive, which may not have even shipped until 1983. However, there was this one little weird thing I found while trying to figure all this out. This one line in a September 1982 issue of InfoWorld that said one manufacturer, Jonos Computers, is already offering a computer that uses twin Sony microfloppy drives. Two things there left me with even more questions. Who on earth is Jonos? And that word, already. That one line spiraled this video out of control. Did this computer exist, and could it have possibly beat Sony to be the first computer with their own product? Well, I can confirm firsthand, it did exist, but pinning down when it released, though, is a lot harder. It turned out that in the same month that Sony announced the SMC-70 and the $30 million deal with HP, they also announced a much smaller $1 million contract with the company Jonos Limited. Jonos had only been around for 2 years, but just earlier in February of 1982 was advertising new terminals and RAM cards that were likely for S100 systems. They were a growing company, and it seemed they also wanted to get into the home computer market, and were looking to make a complete system themselves. Already knowing how to make a machine like a terminal and the internal components of a computer made this fairly easy. They just needed the part supplies to put them together. After signing the deal in May with Sony, Jonos had a working system complete and called it the Courier. It is a very simple STD backplane machine with an integrated terminal running an 8085 and a CPU card with a Z80 designed to run CP/M. This machine was shown off as early as June 7th at the National Computer Conference. Not only was it being shown though, Jonos had a full array of add-ons available for it, like additional interface cards, an attachable printer, and a Gucci carry case. And of course, it had Sony 3.5-inch floppy drives. Now we only have Sony's announcement of when the contract was signed for when Jonos had the drives secured, but sure seems like they had been working on it for a lot longer than 1 month. Not only that, they'd already worked out some third-party contracts like a deal with Olivetti to provide customer service. And in at least as early as August 1982, Jonos even had print advertisements for the system. In many discussions around the floppy disk standards battle, Jonos was brought up right alongside HP as a user of the Sony floppy drives. They were a small company, around 30 employees, so if they weren't actually producing something, I doubt they would have been getting treated like this. Being small also benefited them for radical products like this because there was a low risk to innovate, and they could get them designed much faster than larger companies with slow corporate structures. From all of my research, I see no reason to doubt that the Jonos was available with 3.5-inch floppies before the Sony SMC came to market. I would even go so far as to say that it was likely available to purchase at and after the June NCC show, with the journalist saying there it is available at a price of $39.95. So, I'm going to make the claim here and now. Jonos Limited was the first company to sell a computer with the 3.5-inch floppy drive. Jonos even continued to produce and evolve the computer. Around the time the ANSI Committee modified Sony drives came out, Jonos renamed the Courier to the Escort and introduced the elevated model I have here with more RAM and features. It went on to be reviewed in publications like Popular Science, where its 3.5-inch floppy drives still made it stand out. There's a lot more to say about this very interesting computer, but that should be left for another video. Back to the floppies themselves, Sony was the one making all the drives and the computers we've talked about so far. But getting other companies to make drives as well was a big step in wider support. Tandon was the first with the TM35 drive in late 1982. In 1983, Shugart announced the SA300 drive that supported the Sony format. Other manufacturers like TIAC and Mitsumi would join in too. And in 1987, the final common version of the 3.5-inch disc with high density sectors came out. On PC systems, it was formatted to hold about 1.4 megabytes of data. This was the last widely accepted version of the floppy disk. There was a 2.8 megabyte version and other formats like the zip disk and super disk that were introduced, but before they could dethrone the HD Sony disk, the CD-ROM came out holding far more data and also partially designed by Sony. Even then, the 1.4 megabyte drives continued to be the easiest way to move around small files until flash drives became affordable. Sony continued making HD microfloppy disks until 2011, ending its reign after 3 decades. The majority of people never touched an 8-inch disc, and the 5.25-inch disc was being phased out by the 90s. So when people think of a floppy disk, they think of the product that Sony developed that had to fight for its place, but definitely left its mark in computer history. Well, that's it for this video about the origins of the 3.5-inch floppy drive. I have a massive shout out to give to Digital Ice Age, who did help me a tremendous amount with research on this video. Thank you. If you enjoyed this video though, you may want to follow to be notified when I release another one. And if you want to help support the channel, you can find me on Patreon. But for now, that's it, and I will see you next time.